Good morning, dear learners, and welcome to the MOOC on economics of gender and development. And we are in week 3, and this is module 9 on integrated gender analysis. And myself, Dr. Bhaskar Sharma, from Assistant Professor in Economics from Kekahandi State Open University, Guwahati, Assam. So, dear learners, here we will be basically dealing with the concept of integrated gender analysis. And already in the previous modules of this course, we have gained the basic idea. The gender is an interdisciplinary issue, and hence, gender must be studied from an interconnected perspective rather than studying it as an isolated or unique discipline. So, this necessitates that we examine gender with an integrated analytical approach. And here, the IGA, that is Integrated Gender Analysis, is a systematic framework used in policy making, program design, and research to examine how gender roles, relations, and inequalities influence and are influenced by social, economic, and environmental factors. And this IGA aims to identify and address gender disparities to promote equity and inclusivity, often integrated into broader development or organizational strategies. Now, if you look at the key components of IGA, we find that IGA, integrated gender analysis, encompasses several core elements, including an examination of gender roles and relations, which looks at how societal expectations of men and women shape access to resources, decision making, and opportunities. It also emphasizes intersectionality, considering how gender intersects with other factors like age, ethnicity, class, disability, and location to reveal compounded inequalities. Additionally, IGA evaluates power dynamics to understand who controls resources, benefits, and burdens, and how policies can reinforce or challenge gender based power imbalances. Finally, it relies on data and indicators, employing qualitative and quantitative methods such as surveys and case studies to assess gender impacts, including differences in participation rates, income levels, or health outcomes. Now, let us look what are the purpose and benefits of IGA. How we benefit. The primary purpose of IGA is to ensure that interventions are not gender neutral but actively incorporate gender perspectives to avoid unintended biases. For instance, it helps prevent policies that disproportionately benefit one gender or exacerbate inequalities. The benefits are substantial, leading to more effective and sustainable outcomes, reduce poverty, and enhanced social justice by fostering equitable solutions. Now, the major applications of IGA include that integrated gender analysis finds practical use in various contexts, such as development aid, where organizations like the World Bank or UN agencies apply it in projects related to education, health, and agriculture to tailor solutions, ensuring women farmers receive equal training and credit. In policy and governance, governments use it in budgeting, urban planning, or climate action to address gender gaps, such as in disaster response, where women face higher risk. Integrated gender analysis is also relevant in corporate and organizational settings where companies integrate it into diversity initiatives or supply chains to improve equity and comply with standards like those from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 5 on gender equality. This method draws from frameworks like Gender and Development, as you call it GAD, and is supported by tools from bodies such as UN Women or OECD. For practical guidance, resources like the UN's Gender Mainstreaming Manual provide a step-by-step implementation framework. Now, in this module, we shall basically take up the discussion on IGA in the specific context of gender budgeting. Thus, after a basic discussion of the concept of gender budgeting, we shall discuss the standard methodologies used in gender budget preparation. Then we shall also discuss the standard approaches and principles followed in gender budgeting, and further, while drawing evidences on important issues relating to gender budgeting from across the space, we shall particularly look into the practice and issues faced in the implementation of gender budgeting in India. So, let us now discuss the concept and definition of gender budgeting or gender response budgeting. Gender budgeting, which is also frequently called as gender response budgeting, GRB in brief, is a strategic approach to fiscal planning and resource allocation that integrates gender perspectives into government budgets and financial decision-making processes. It involves analyzing how budgetary policies and expenditures impact men and women differently, ensuring that public spending promotes gender equality and addresses disparities in areas like income, employment, health, and education. Now, with the aim of mainstreaming gender, Australia pioneered the concept of gender budgeting in 1984, requiring federal departments of the country to submit reports demonstrating the impact of their programs on women. Following the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, which called for gender perspectives in all macroeconomic policies, over 80 countries have implemented various forms of GRB, that is, gender response budgeting. Now, in gender response budgeting, different nations have adopted diverse trajectories. For example, Austria is a global leader, having constitutionally mandated GRB in 2009, which requires all federal ministries to include gender equality targets in their budget processes. Similarly, in South Korea, GRB led to tangible infrastructure changes such as modifying building codes to reduce average waiting times for restrooms for women. Now, in Bangladesh, the government incorporated GRB into its medium-term budgetary framework to align gender issues with strategic planning and sustainable development goals, as this is basically SDG 5. Conversely, some experiences, such as in Portugal, have been critiqued as window dressing due to a lack of political mandate and technical capability. Now, if you look at the key components of gender budgeting, we will find that at its core, gender budgeting, it requires disaggregating budget data by gender to reveal how revenues, expenditures, and allocations affect different groups. This also includes conducting gender impact assessment on proposed budgets, tracking spending on gender-specific programs such as childcare or maternal health, and incorporating gender indicators into performance metrics. It also involves participatory processes where stakeholders like women's groups and civil society organizations contribute to budget formulations to ensure inclusivity. Tools like gender responsive budgeting checklist or software for data analysis are often employed to facilitate this, drawing on frameworks from organizations such as the UN Women and the International Monetary Fund. Now, what are the basic purposes and benefits we get from gender budgeting? The primary purpose of gender budgeting is to eliminate gender biases in fiscal policies that might otherwise perpetuate inequalities such as underfunding women's health or education. By highlighting how budgets can reinforce or challenge gender roles, it aims to allocate resources more fairly, leading to broader societal benefits like reduced poverty, improved economic productivity, and stronger social cohesion. Now, for instance, studies from the OECD countries show that gender budgeting can enhance the effectiveness of public spending, with countries like Sweden demonstrating how it boosts women's workforce participation through targeted investments in affordable childcare. Overall, it fosters accountability and transparency in governance, ensuring that fiscal decisions align with commitments to gender equality under international agreements like the Beijing Platform for Action. Now, the major applications of gender budgeting. Gender budgeting is applied across various sectors and levels of government. In national budgets, it might involve earmarking funds for gender equality initiatives such as subsidies for women's entrepreneurship or violence prevention programs. Similarly, at the local level, municipalities use it to assess infrastructure projects like public transport for their impact on women's mobility and safety. And internationally, we see that it supports development aid, where donors like the World Bank integrate gender budgeting into loan conditions to promote sustainable outcomes and gender equality. So, challenges include data limitations and political resistance, but successful implementation in countries like Rwanda and India illustrate its potential to drive transformative change with evidence of increased female representation in decision making and narrowed gender gaps in key indicators. Now, so far we have discussed the concept of integrated gender analysis and gender response budgeting or gender budgeting. So, let us just make a brief comparative analysis between these two concepts. Now, based on our above discussion, we can briefly make a basic comparative analysis of the concepts, basically on theoretical approaches and global practices associated with integrated gender analysis IGA or gender response budgeting GRB or gender budgeting. So we have already seen that while integrated gender analysis provides the framework, gender responsive budgeting serves as its practical fiscal application. So let us consider table 1 and you can see some points more clearly. So in table 1 we see that in parameters like there are certain parameters that we have taken for a comparative analysis between IGA and GRB, and this includes a definition, primary goal, core method and scope. So regarding definition, we see that IGA is basically a systematic framework to examine how gender roles and inequalities influence social, economic and environmental factors. And the definition of GRB is like that. It's a strategic approach to fiscal planning that integrates gender as perspective into government budgets and financial decisions. So basically GRB is a policy tool. And the primary goal of IGA is to identify and address gender disparities to promote equity and inclusivity in policy and research. And with respect to GRB, you can see that its primary goal is to ensure public spending that promotes gender equality and address disparities in income, health and education, and the similar other variables. And the core method of IGA is it uses qualitative and quantitative data, for example surveys, case studies, to evaluate power dynamics and intersectionality. And this GRB, it disaggregates budget data by gender and conducts impact assessment on revenues and expenditures. And the scope of IGA is its broad application is found in development aid, urban planning, climate action and corporate diversity. And the scope of GRB is like that. Its specific application in national and local government budget cycles, okay, in formulation of audit, etc. We find the application of GRB. Now, let us look at the methodological framework of gender response budgeting or gender budgeting as such. So, gender response budgeting is an analytical approach designed to scrutinize budget formulation, policies, and outlays through a gender lens. And rather than a separate fund, it serves as a tool to reveal gender differentiated impacts and translate political commitments into fiscal realities. And the implementation of GRB varies by budget formats. Performance-based budgeting and program-based budgeting provide the strongest framework for integration. For example, Austria and Sweden utilize PBB, that is performance-based budgeting, to integrate gender-specific performance targets directly into the budgets. And similarly, the Andalusia province in Spain, it uses program budgeting through its G+ program to prioritize objectives that significantly impact gender parity. Now, please note that here in Andalusia, Spain, budget programs are rated as G+, G, G1 and G0 based on their gender relevance, with G+ being the most impactful category. The G+ program are categorized as those budget programs with the highest potential to reduce gender inequality, requiring specific gender-focused objectives and actions for funding. So let us now discuss the four distinct phases of GRB. The budget cycle approach to GRB follows four distinct phases of the budget cycle. Okay, first is the formulation. Governments use endangered budget call circulars to instruct agencies to include gender in request. In countries like India and Rwanda, it utilizes mandatory gender budget statements to detail program impacts. And in countries like Iceland, gender equality targets must be explicitly included when drafting the national budget. With regard to the approval step, we find that legislative bodies use specific guidelines to assess proposed laws. For example, in Mexico, female parliamentarians have successfully used these mechanisms to increase resources for women's needs. And in the execution phases, we see that this involves gender-aware guidelines for procurement and staffing. For example, in Israel, it has implemented a mandatory tenders law that prioritizes women-controlled business in tight bids. And in audit and evaluation, Austria's Court of Audit evaluates spending against gender outcomes, while Victoria, Australia, has utilized community-based gender audits to monitor local impacts. Now, in Table 2, we can see a comparative scenario of budget cycle, namely the action and tools used, as well as the major counties in which these are applied to. So, here in Table 2, we see that in case of formulation, engendered budgets, call circulars, and mandatory statements. Okay, this is the action or tool used. And examples include India and Rwanda use gender budget statements. In the approval phase, legislative guidelines for awareness proposed laws. And here we see the example of Mexico's female parliamentarians use this to increase resources for women. In the execution phase, the tools or action are basically gender-aware procurement and staffing guidelines. And we can take the example of Israel, which focuses on women-owned businesses in government tenders. And in the audit or evaluation phase, evaluating spending against gender outcomes is undertaken. And we can see the examples of Austria's Court of Audit. It evaluates outcomes. And in Victoria Province of Australia, it uses community audits. Now, let us discuss some of the analytical tools and innovations in gender response budgeting. Specific technical tools are used to measure impact. Expenditure incidence analysis was used in Ghana and Pakistan to compare budget benefits of education spending between genders. And in Zambia, it utilized time use studies to identify how cuts in health spending shifted care burdens onto women. And in Sri Lanka, beneficiary assessments via focus group revealed how poverty constrained women's access to vocational training. Now, let us discuss some of the approaches and principles of gender response budgeting. Gender response budgeting is based on the fundamental principle that government budgets are not gender neutral. Because women and men occupy different social and economic positions, seemingly neutral fiscal policies often have gender differentiated impacts, a phenomenon known as gender blindness. So, rather than creating a separate budget for women, gender response budgeting serves as an analytical tool to ensure public resources are allocated equitably to meet the needs of all citizens. Available literature identifies two primary mainstreaming approaches: integrationist and agenda setting or transformative. The integrationist approach adds a gender perspective into existing paradigms without challenging underlying power structures. In contrast, the transformative approach seeks to reorient the entire political and fiscal agenda to dismantle institutionalized gender hierarchies. So, historically, if you see, the practice of gender response budgeting has evolved from a women in development, we call it WID in brief, approach, which focused on women specific projects in isolation, to a gender and development, GAD approach, which analyzes the power relations between men and women. Recent frameworks also include the right-based approach, viewing gender equality as a human right, and the capability approach, which focuses on enhancing individual well-being and valuable functionings. Now, let us consider some of the global practices and examples. Different nations utilize various methodological entry points for GRB. One is performance-based objectives. For example, Austria constitutionally mandates that all federal ministries include at least one gender equality target in their budget chapters. Classification systems. Here, suppose countries like India, it utilizes a two-part gender budget statement, distinguishes between schemes with 100% targeted at women as part A, and those with at least 30% allocation in gender components, which we call it part B. And spending quotas. This is followed in countries like the Philippines. It mandates that government agencies allocate at least 5% of their total annual appropriation to gender and development plans. Another is intersectional analysis. In countries like Canada, it employs gender-based analysis plus, GBA plus, a sophisticated model that considers how gender intersects with race, ethnicity, disability, and age. And infrastructure reform. This is another tool. In countries like South Korea, GRB led to tangible change in building code to reduce wait times for women restrooms, as you already had mentioned. So ultimately, effective GRB moves beyond number crunching to address strategic gender interests such as political empowerment and safety, rather than merely practical needs like maternal health. Now, let us briefly consider a comparative global scenario on the practices and mechanisms followed in GRB in brief, as can be seen from table 3. So, here in table 3, we see that in countries like Australia, Austria, India, Canada, South Korea, Philippines, Israel, Sweden, and Portugal. Okay, here we can see the primary mechanism or tool that are used and the key outcome or features that are seen. So, suppose in Australia, it pioneered gender response budgeting in 1984, and it's basically a community-based gender audits. In Victoria, it is undertaken, and the major outcomes are that required federal departments to report programs impacts on women. Okay. Similarly, we see the cases of Austria as well. And suppose in India, we see the gender response budgeting. As you already told, there are two parts. In part 1, we see 100% women dedicated to women, and in part B, we see that 30% or more of the budgeted components are allocated to women component. Okay, and it's institutionalized through gender budgeting cells in 52 ministries. Okay, similarly, we can see the examples of Canada, South Korea, Philippines, Israel, Sweden, and Portugal. Now, let us concentrate what has been the progress, issues, and challenges faced in gender response budgeting in India. Gender responsive budgeting in India is situated within a complex social landscape where religion, customs, and age-old prejudices have historically placed women in subservient and exploitable positions. Indian women frequently face disparities in access to and control over resources, which are reflected in social indicators such as health, nutrition, and illiteracy. Consequently, the Indian government views budget not as a separate document for women, but as a critical analytical tool for affirmative action to redress these gender gaps and ensure that public funds respond to the needs of all citizens adequately. The historical evolution of GRB in India is traced back to the 1974 Towards Equality report. It's a very important report, which highlighted how the country's development trajectory had created new imbalances and disparities for women. While early efforts in the first 5-year plan, 1951-1956, were welfare-oriented, the fifth plan, during the period 1974 to 78, it marked a significant paradigm shift from welfare to development. So by the eighth plan, 1990-97, we see the government introduced a specific gender perspective in resource allocation, which was further solidified in the next plan. This is the 9-5-year plan of 1997-2002, though the women component plan mandating that at least 30% of funds in relevant sectors be earmarked for women. Now, India formally adopted GRB in 2005, introducing a mandatory gender budget statement, GBS, within the union budget. So, this statement utilizes a two-way classification. Part A, as you already told, is identifies schemes with 100% of allocations directed towards women, and while Part B, it captures women schemes where at least 30% of the flow is directed towards women. So, to institutionalize this process, gender budgeting cells have been established in 52 ministries and departments to serve as focal points for gender mainstreaming and the collection of sex disaggregated data. Now, relevant examples of programs categorized under this framework include the Support to Training and Employment Program (STEP), Hostels for Working Women, and the Rashtriya Mahila Course, which provides credits for women. Other critical initiatives include Swadhar, which assists women in difficult circumstances, and the Indira Gandhi Matritva Sahyog Yojana, a maternity benefit scheme. Despite these advancements, scholars note that the approach often remains piecemeal and faces challenges such as bureaucratic failure and a lack of proper fund utilization. Now, at a sub-national level, if we look at the sub-national level, we find that gender-responsive budgeting in India was pioneered by Odisha in 2004, followed by states such as Karnataka and Gujarat in 2006. As of 2015, at least 16 states have adopted this fiscal innovation to address gender disparities through the mandatory inclusion of gender budget statements in their annual documents. States have institutionalized these processes through specific mechanisms. For instance, Karnataka utilizes its Fiscal Policy Institute (FPI) to validate department schemes and provide technical training. Allocation at the state level are generally categorized into Part A, 100% women specific, and Part B, at least 30% to 99% for women. Karnataka uniquely reclassifies its Part A outlays into functional categories such as livelihood, health, education, nutrition, and the welfare of women in difficult circumstances. While total gender allocations in Karnataka grew roughly fourfold over a decade, Part A allocates remaining relatively small. The critics note that state level gender budgeting remains largely welfare oriented, focusing on practical needs rather than strategic empowerment such as political inclusion of women in STEM fields. Moreover, higher outlays have not consistently improved outcomes, as evidenced by persistent levels of anemia and maternal mortality in Karnataka compared to neighboring states. So, now based on our above discussion, we can summarize the major discussion on gender budgeting with the help of the following figure 1. Okay, and here in figure you can see it basically summarizes the concept like what is gender budgeting, okay, and how gender budgeting is seen in action. So you please see this figure very minutely, and you will find that the entire discussion on gender responsive budgeting has been summarized here. So thank you, and in the next module, that is in module 10, we shall take up discussion on applied feminist economics in policy and practice. And basically, this module builds up on our earlier discussion on feminist economics as was discussed in module 6. Thank you.